I'll try and get this done reasonably quickly because the real business of the day is to get on and have some fun testing. But there are some things that people have asked me to say from collected corners of the forum just to sort of set up some context for today. So let me go through those. We'll talk about where we are, the latest news in specs for those who may not have found that yet. I want to say a few words about ACPI, which is now our collective responsibility in addition to the UEFI spec. SCTs, you guys are all going to presumably play with SCTs a lot in the coming couple of days. So Dong provided me some information about where we are with releases on that and plans for that. I want to talk about some of the PR. We've been, for the last year or so, taking a bit more interest in what's going on and what people are saying about the work that we're doing. And there's a couple of conclusions I want to draw out of that for everybody. A quick flyby on upcoming event logistics, which is more of a mention because it'll prompt you to think, oh, there's another event coming, I need to find out the details. And then we'll wrap up and get everybody onto the business of testing. So for those who are not familiar with the local area, one of the other things that is iconic about this area is we're home to Fort Lewis, or what's now known as Joint Base Lewis-McChord, because it has the Air Force Base there. This is the largest West Coast Army base facility. And we have something like 16,000 soldiers, and I swear 2 of those fender benders were soldiers fighting with each other on the highway this morning. But I think we're actually in pretty good shape. The work that we're putting out, the products that we're putting out, some of the feedback we're getting is pretty good. So a strong Army boot to sort of replicate a metaphor for our state of the forum. Mostly good news, but there's some not so good news as well, and I'll get to that when we talk about some of the PR things, which is really why I wanted to bring some of that up. The good news, I think, is that UEFI Secure Boot now shipping on lots of different platforms, and we're seeing multiple operating systems support it in good shape. We've had a little bit of teething trouble here and there, getting things, bugs worked out of the corner cases and things of that sort, but for the most part, it seems to be out there, and I think it really is genuinely adding value for end user folks. So that's obviously good. I think looking forward, the main thing I would tell you that collectively I think we need to focus on is execution. Right? Building the product, getting the quality levels to where we want them, delivering the feature sets that we're interested in, and making sure that all the pieces parts work together. This community is, as much as any that I've worked with in my entire career, all about intercepts, right? We have multiple communities around the table, operating system folks, OEMs, ODMs building systems, add-in card folks, Utilities people. There's a collection of people, all of whose products need to work together if we're going to actually have something successful to offer to the community at large. And events like this, where we do sort of interoperability testing, very much a proof point there. So I'm really happy to see our full room for an interoperability testing event. Okay, latest state of the specifications. UEFI spec is up to B level errata now. We made that release middle part of April. Right now, I'm not aware of any pacing item for a new version of the spec. What that means in real money is nobody's come to me and said, I need this thing added to the specification and I need it by date X, because we have product dependencies leaning on that. So right now, the UEFI spec is kind of in a holding pattern, which is probably good, right? Gives us a chance to have everybody's implementations catch up with the current latest, greatest state. But the other piece of the message here is, if you're aware of something coming that you will have a product dependency on, that we need to get through the specification, now be a good time to let me know so that we can plan for that and get it shoehorned in. But right now, the UEFI spec work group is mostly looking at clarification, errata. That's the work of the day there. There's a shell spec 2.1. When I wrote this, I think it was undergoing work group review. We're done with that process now. So if it's not already on the public website, it will be any second now. I'm not entirely sure whether anybody's looked for that lately, but it's on the cusp of coming out. I think we're going to talk about it tomorrow afternoon with the board, getting that through the formal reviews. The PI spec platform init is up to 1.3. Again, stability is the main name of the game there. We really haven't touched that specification in quite a long while now. And I'm aware of nothing in the hopper for that one that would cause us to think about a spec update either. There are probably less people in the room that are worried about that particular one, but again, if you're aware of something that we might need to go visit in this space, let me know. Okay, ACPI 5, we've published a 5.0A as sort of the last act of the ACPI SIG. And now the forum here has taken over responsibility for care and feeding of that document as we go forward. So there is, if you're not aware of it, an ASWG now, the ACPI spec work group. So if you haven't found that yet and you're interested in this topic, member pages, you'll find a place to sign up for that. But that group is up and running and sort of taking over. So the formal transfer of ownership was done in October of last year, and the work group's been running since January of this year. And with vigor and energy, I would say, there's quite a number of things in the hopper that we're looking at here for an updated specification. In fact, so much so that there are some things that look real urgent to the point where we're going to think about probably publishing this specification maybe even twice this year, or at least once this year and another one early next at the latest. So there's 3 or 4 things that people are looking for as fairly immediate updates, added functionality that we need. I think broadly characterized, I'd say these are things that people are looking at for ultra mobile style platforms, so like phone, tablet, those kinds of use case spaces. So primarily those quick adds are going into support those kinds of platforms. And then there's a number of things that have a slightly longer fuse. I think there's a discussion going on about low power management states, which is going to take a little bit longer to resolve because there are some pretty complicated issues associated with that topic. And that will probably get done in time for an update towards the end of the year, or maybe into Q1 of next year by the time we actually see it out the door. Okay, so SCTs. The latest official release is a test instrument against the 2.3.1c UEFI specification. The 2.4 is in development now. We've done something a little different with this go around. By popular request, the code has actually moved into a accessible repository that everybody can get at. Everybody in the member company body corpus can get at. There was an alpha release of that in March, and we would recommend that that is the one that you go use for this event. In the second half of this year, there are some older pieces of the code that depend on the EFI shell, the old shell, and the libraries wrapped around that. So obviously, as we move all of our products forward, particularly machines that are shipping with copies of the new shell inboard, that makes it more difficult to test. So we're going to go fix all of those dependencies. Probably the biggest open issue for this group to be wrestling with is what do we do with ACPI? One of the things that when you bring a specification into the forum, our sort of charter responsibility says we're going to publish a spec and we're going to help you build your implementation by giving you a self-certification test suite. Well, no such animal exists today for ACPI. There are some pieces, parts that would be potentially interesting and useful. For those of you working on ACPI implementation, I'm sure you will have found acpica.org, for example. There's a full set of open source tools available for ACPI implementation work out there, some of which would be potentially quite interesting as test fodder. The decompiler for AML, for example, is if you decompile and recompile, the compiler on ACPI CA is very fussy about the syntax in particular out there, and it can find problems for you just by doing a decompile, recompile kind of loop. So there's some things that might prototypically turn into test instruments fairly quickly out there. There's also a couple of industry efforts that are already underway. FWTS, Firmware Test Suite, something that I think Canonical folks have been spearheading. There's probably people in the room that might know all about that. In any event, though, the work group is sort of considering what to do about what approach to take with respect to this testing problem. There'll be live discussion during the week here, I think, Dong, right? We're going to have an opportunity for people to talk about this question. Do we want to hitch our wagon to the FWTS approach? There's another test suite, biosbits.org, I think, has some prototypical test case code on it as well. So there's a couple of things that we might co-opt that are already present in the ecosystem. And then, of course, there's the make from scratch kind of approach as well, which could be interesting. Anyway, so the discussion is alive and not necessarily concluded. If you're interested in that discussion, please talk to Dong this week and ask what's going on with that. For reference, there are ongoing meetings held on Tuesdays. The time for that is 3 o'clock Pacific. So you can join that group and get signed up and participate in the conversation by dialing into those meetings. Okay, as I said, the board took a decision a while ago to take a more close look at what's going on in the PR ecosystem around UEFI. I think that was spurred mostly by the fact that we were getting some less than favorable reviews out in the wide world of sports. And we wanted to at least get our side of the story on the table so that we could balance some of the stories that were getting written. So these are, I asked the guys that are looking after this for us to send me some information about what they've seen of late. These are just a few clips. There are a lot of mentions now in a lot of different venues. So this is just sort of like a sampling of some of the ones that are starting to come out and have relatively positive, or at least neutral to positive kinds of discussion about the work that we've been doing. On the flip side, there are definitely still some perception things for us to work on. Along with the good, there are some less than favorable things, some of which are, I think when we analyze them, driven by lack of information available to the people writing the stories, and that's an education opportunity for us. And some of them are just questions where people don't like what we're doing for one reason or another. And that is educational for us potentially as well, to understand what people's issues are. Some of them we may not be able to do anything about. But on the other hand, there are probably things that we can learn from that less than stellar reviews, shall we say, that would help us in terms of directions on things that we need to continue working on or add to the work list in order to improve the result on the receiving end. So I guess I sort of think about our ecosystem and sort of, this is a question I ask myself on a fairly ongoing basis: how are we doing collectively as an ecosystem? I mentioned this intercept thing, right? With multiple communities around the table, this effort only works if we're all working together and all of our products actually interoperate in some sensible way. So we sort of have to look at the problem in terms of, are we being successful or not, as an ecosystem kind of challenge. So I think there are two things that I try and sort of measure in my mind. How are we doing? Right? Delivering on the actual specification work, that's our primary charter responsibility. Building good specs that are reasonably well written, that are understandable, that are at least approaching testable, so we make the UTWG's work as reasonable as possible. And then secondarily, delivering high quality implementations. A spec is only any good if it gets used, if it gets implemented, and the resulting implementations are better than the status quo ante. Right? If we wrote a whole specification, people did a bunch of work, and we produced something that actually is a retrograde step in the minds of most end users sitting in front of products, then, you know, hey, we didn't do a good job. So those are kind of the sort of macro level things that I think about in terms of our progress. I think we can give ourselves a passing grade on the specifications. Generally speaking, when I get feedback on the specs, the biggest complaint I hear is, it's big, right? There's a lot of it. And surely there is, but there are a lot of topics that we need to treat. And if you sit down to actually use the specification, it's written more as a reference than it is a work of fiction, right? Not recommended for bedtime reading. It will put you to sleep in 2.5 seconds. But on the other hand, if you've got implementation work to do, it's actually pretty darn useful. There's a lot of information in there. And it's pretty specific, and the work group has been diligent over the last, however long it is, right? Since 2005 we were working on this specification. Diligent in putting together clarification and errata. The thing is getting pretty tight as a specification. PI, same thing. ACPI, we've got some work to do there. But I think we're applying a bit more discipline to how the construction of that is going to happen going forward. We've made a commitment to even consider rewriting some of the sections that are less than crystal clear. So hopefully we'll take the methodology that we've been successful with on the USWG front and move it into the ACPI spec working group as well. The implementation thing, I think that's where we've got to focus. And when I said 2014, let's focus on execution, this is what I mean, right? When you look at some of those mentions that we're getting in the press, typically the thing that we're getting beat on most that falls outside the lack of education bucket is there are snafus in our implementation, one way or another, to the point where things are, misfunction, misfeature, outright bug. We've certainly had people tell us that systems are, bricked when you do updates or change variables, things of that sort. These are situations, true or not, the perception is created in some instances. So, it's uneven across the board, but in general, I think where we're doing a pretty good job with the specs, I think we've got some work to do on implementation, and that would be the big, if I got one thing across in the conversation today, that's what I'd like to do. Collectively, our best foot is forward when we all do a good job on implementation. And I know that starts at home for me, right? I work for Intel. There are some things that we've not done in a stellar fashion inside of our pieces of the code. Also, if you watch the check-ins on tianocore.org, you'll see lots of security things across the last 18 months, 2 years, things that we've had to tighten up considerably. But I think this is a collective responsibility. No one of us can be successful on getting a high-quality implementation as far as end-user perception is concerned, unless this intercept thing that I talked about happens, right? We all have to do our part. So that's really what I would entreat everybody to think about for this year and going forward. So I think it's time to, make sure that the promise in the specification is delivered in the product. We've traditionally, as a forum, had a view where we work only on the specifications and the test instruments that go with those, and we sort of stay away from discussion of implementation issues, aside from events like this where we're actually working on interoperability. I think some of the particularly security-driven concerns that we've had talked about in the PR venues, security is obviously getting a much higher profile, right? Mr. Snowden, Heartbleed, the stories are left and right here. So there's obviously a lot of focus in the wide world of sports at the moment on security issues in general, and we're not without our own, target profile there also, given the emphasis on secure boot as part of 231C and how much dependency we have on that in shipping systems now. Windows 8 requires it. It's obviously a security feature front and center. That's what it's for. So we sort of, in a sense, we sort of painted a target on ourselves right there as far as the security topic is concerned. So I think as a matter of debate, we should probably revisit the question of how much interest we take in implementation as a forum. Excuse me. Should we take a more proprietorial interest as a forum in implementation issues in general? There are a number of places where this might take effect. The PI work group has produced a document that talks about best practices for implementation as far as security is concerned. Right now, that's an internal document. Maybe we should make it public. There's a lot of information in there about how to build a high-quality, high-integrity implementation. Sage words of advice in that document that would potentially do two things, right? For those who are not inside the PI spec work group, it would provide them the information, and secondarily, I think it would demonstrate to the world in general that, hey, we are actually paying attention to these security issues. It may not be apparent, up to today that we have a serious set of folks sitting down thinking about that, but we do, and here's some of the work product that goes with that. The Tiana Core implementation is an open source reference, in a sense, reference with a small r. We could make it reference with a big R. Right? We could take a more proprietorial ownership of ensuring that that is complete and of high quality there as a collective forum too. So those are just a couple of examples. There are probably more, but I think it's probably high time for us to at least revisit this. And maybe we will conclude that, no, it's not such a great idea. But I think given some of the emphasis, particularly on the security things, and particularly what a caustic negative effect having issues in that space could have on all of our collective well-being, this is a debate that's probably worth having. So that is by way of talking to some of the board members who will meet tomorrow. That's something that I think we ought to spend some time thinking about. But amongst your discussions this week, as you all meet and work on testing kinds of issues, I'd be interested in feedback on that as you talk to each other, bounce ideas around. Let me know what you think. So upcoming events, there's a LinuxCon, which I think is in Chicago. Yeah, Chicago. So if you're planning to go to that, we're trying to work with the foundation to see if we can get a full day of track events on all things UEFI as part of that event. We have a full Plugfest on the calendar. I don't think the details are really well nailed down yet, but it'll be sometime in October, and we're looking at Taipei again next year. The last one we had in Taipei went pretty well and was well attended, so it seems like repeating that experience might not be a bad plan. Okay, so let me wrap up and get you all onto the main business of the day. I think we've had a pretty successful couple of years. It was a long, hard march to get 2.3.1c named, let alone out the door, right? We had lots of debate about what we should call the flipping thing. But we did get the secure boot features in there, and that is now shipping. That's work that we can essentially bank, right? Successfully complete. A couple of hangnails here and there in some of the implementations we go past, but for the most part, I'd consider that something that we've done pretty successful. Particularly with respect to ACPI, the spec work continues at a fast and furious pace. I'm continually impressed by how much participation we get in these work groups. I've done a lot of standards work in my career, last 25 odd years, whatever it is. Of all the standards efforts I've been around, this is by far and away the most productive collegial atmosphere specification group that I've ever been around. So thank you to all of you that participate in that. It makes my life a lot more fun when we have that kind of environment around the work. Obviously, we're getting a certain amount of reward for the success that we've had, moving the ACPI specification into the forum's responsibility bucket. Would not happen unless the member companies, and in particular the promoter member companies, right, which is a pretty big heavy hitter list of corporations, they'd have to agree that this is a good idea, and that's a vote of confidence in everybody in this room, in all the work that we do. Right, so you should take a moment to be proud of the fact that our scope's increased in that respect because of the job that we're doing. But as I mentioned, the ACPI guys are starting to think about adding for features for phones and tablets. We haven't yet come across a feature that somebody wanted in firmware for the Internet of Things, but that buzzword is out there, and I'm sure we'll get something before too terribly long. And I think that's by way of saying that the field of opportunity for us to continue working here is wide open. There's lots for us still yet to do. So with that, I think I'll sort of close out. I'll stop for a couple of questions if you guys want, but other than that, I hope everybody has a fantastic, productive week for testing.